Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here, and as I've slowly but surely prepared this new space for music and video production, a few things have crossed my mind. First and foremost, sound treatment, which is underway. Already moving in some furniture in here has helped a lot with the echo, but we've got some soundproofing material on the way, so just bear with me, a few more videos, and hopefully we'll have this rounded out. But another thing with getting all this gear into one space and thinking about how to manage it all is guitar tube amplifiers, because we've been kind of on a kick of drive and, well, mostly dirt and distortion pedals over the past few months. And, you know, I kind of go in cycles with some of this stuff. I'll get a kick on plugins, and then it'll be pedals, and it'll be back to amplifiers. And I kind of feel another wave of amps coming on. So I wanted to talk about some of my most sought after dream amplifiers, the ones that, you know, I don't necessarily need, no one really does at the end of the day, but ones that have inspired me to, you know, look into the technology as a whole, or ones that, you know, kind of made me grab the ones that I actually own right now, and just go over some cool pieces of gear in general. A lot of these I don't have a hope in hell of ever owning because of rarity or cost. But some of these, you know, it's a bucket list item for me, and hopefully, even if I never have one sitting in this very room, I'll be able to play through it, because some of these, I think, are not only genre-defying in terms of music, but important contributions to tube amps in general. So with that, let's get rolling. Recently, I've been really bad about not limiting these videos to, well, you know, 5 actual picks, so no need to break that cycle anytime soon, I guess. So let's, in rapid succession, go over a few of the runner-ups that are worth considering and worth mentioning, but just don't quite cut it for my top 5 actual dream amplifiers. One that's worth mentioning is some sort of Dumble clone, and one of you called this a few weeks or even a few months back, where you even predicted that the next amplifier I go out and acquire would be a Dumble derivative. Probably not going to be the case, but it is an interesting class of amplifiers, because it's kind of hard to say what is a Dumble amp. There's so many circuit revisions and, you know, even individual models, but there's a lot of them, especially the ones that are modeled on Axe-Fx firmware, that, you know, I kind of get where people are coming from in terms of the hype train. They do have a very open, uncompressed, touch-sensitive kind of aesthetic going on, and pretty cool as both a, you know, boosting platform or even a full-blown pedal platform. So at some point, I think it would be fun to at least experiment with one of those, and definitely lands in my top 10 kind of amplifiers that I would like to play through at some point. In sort of the same class of amplifier, the Fender Bassman would fulfill a very similar role. You know, it's basically the forefather to all things Marshall, Mesa Boogie, and even Dumble. You take one of those sought-after circuits and you're a couple component changes away from like a JTM 45, but they have a very specific open, you know, American style sound that we're all used to. And depending on whether you pair it with, you know, a 2x12 or 4x10 or 4x12, you get very different sounds out of it. And it's kind of a blank slate, where I would have no problem playing anything from country to doom metal on it, depending on what kind of pedal platform I'm using. It's not like the most contemporary sounding amp ever, and I wouldn't use it for that, but it's also one that I wouldn't feel bad about using as a pedal platform, whether it be that or, say, you know, a MiG 50 from Sovtech or Electro Harmonics, because it kind of begs to be, whereas something that's a little more character heavy, I would feel bad about manipulating or distorting to that point. But a Fender Bassman kind of circuit's always like, yeah, just throw it at me. Moving on up both the gain and the price brackets, basically everything that Reinhold Bogner has his name on is absolutely incredible sounding. If I had to pick one, it would probably be the Ecstasy series, because they are so versatile. It's like having 3 or 4 generations of amplifiers in one amplifier head. The Shivas sound wonderful, both as like a lead platform as well as cleans. I'm pretty sure that's been modeled in one of the Neural DSP plugins. It's one of my favorites on Axe-Fx firmware. They sound amazing, super harmonically rich while being like crystalline clean. Then you've got, of course, the Uberschall, which is a metal legend, super high gain, doesn't really need anything. It's just awesome. So Yeah, it'd be hard for me to nail down one, but a Bogner amp would be something pretty cool to own. Another legendary last name in the amplifier business, Fryette, formerly VHT, whether we're talking about the dedicated power amps or some of my favorite heads out there with the Deliverance or the Pitbull. Probably choose the Deliverance if I absolutely had to pick, even if it is just sort of a one-channel thing. They just sound so cool, so unique. They are very familiar sounding, but there's just something about the texture, the gain structure, the overall EQ voicing that, it stands out in the crowd and is one that if you're looking for a different flavor of high gain that isn't just 5150 or Rectifier or boosted Marshall sound, it's a pretty good avenue to explore, especially if you're into the modeling scene on Fractal Audio side of things. They do have that modeled, and there's a new one, so definitely go check it out. Rounding out the runner-ups, we have the Mesa Boogie Stiletto, which is just like a lot of the amps they make, where they'll make one for 3 to 5 years and then pretend it never existed before, which is kind of weird. Just like the Rectifier series, there's a 50-watt Ace, there's a 100-watt Deuce, and the 150-watt version, which has like all sorts of rectifier, tubes, and it's just a monstrosity. But either the 50 or 100-watt version is very interesting to me. It's basically their take on a modified like 2204 circuit, which, a lot of their stuff stems from that. But it's kind of, as one player has put it, like 90s Metallica in a box. Hetfield, I think, really mainlined that amp head for a long time, just kind of his sound for a while. And it's definitely one that I think would handle modern guitars very well. Always been interesting to me. Of course, I've gone kind of a different route with the modded plexi circuits, but it's one that if I ever find a good deal on it, I probably would be hard pressed to turn one down in either the 50-watt or 100-watt variant. And that brings me to my actual top 5 dream guitar amp picks. And you'll notice for these, especially the first few, they kind of inspired me to go out and look for more price-conscious versions of these amplifiers, or ones that are of higher value, things that maybe aren't as maintenance intensive or do more sounds while still covering the same kind of tonal territory. And so that's why I've ended up with some of the amplifiers that I have, because ultimately I'm going for a particular tone, but one that can do just more than this, and you don't have to pay an arm and a leg for it. Which brings me to the Mesa Boogie Mark III Red Stripe. This, for all intents and purposes, is basically the same circuit as the Mark II C+, with a few minor tweaks, but if you put them right next to each other, given the component tolerance differences and stuff, they'll sound pretty much the same. Now, the Red Stripe in particular, among a couple other revisions of the Mark III, is one of the insane, just high gain, balls out revisions of the Mark III. It was, by my memory, like the first Mark series amplifier that I really put kind of a face to the name, if you will. And, that really started my Mark series obsession, and kind of made me go back and explore all the tones that they offered. Now, there's a few other revisions that I would absolutely be okay with owning, between the green stripe, the black stripe, purple. There's even like different subdivisions in between all those stripe series, and they're super convoluted and hard to keep track of. But like the Red Stripe, there's a Coliseum version, there's, the Simulclass, there's a few different things that they brought over that, made life easier coming from the 2C+ if you wanted to use both channels and stuff. But ultimately, it was like the best of the best at that time for high gain, and it's still a super contemporary sound, whether you're listening to the Mark III or the 2C+, or the Mark IV or the Mark V. And ultimately, I opted for a Mark IV because the availability is higher, there's more voicing options, it can cover the 2C+ and 3 ground while having more, clean and edge of breakup, and even the Rhythm 2 channel, which is kind of like channel 1.5. Whereas, like the 3 and the 2C+, you have to share EQ, and it kind of gets a little messy there. But even if the Mark III isn't quite as feature-rich as the series that would succeed it, with more dedicated EQ options per channel and some of the toggle switches you see on the 4, there's still a lot of that came from the Mark III, like foot switchable reverb and the graphic EQ and that kind of stuff. So to me, especially when we talk about the circuits, the amps haven't really gotten better. Like, that is the pinnacle of tone to me, you know, and a lot of the stuff that I shoot for with the Mark IV is basically that sound, and it does it, I mean, almost perfectly, because there are little differences here and there, but for the most part, they're all part of the same lineage. And all these amplifiers that we're talking about that are now 30 years old plus, I mean, they still keep up with the most contemporary designs. Most of them for 6-string and 7-string work, you don't even have to use any sort of boost, which is just crazy. But especially if you do, then it's, you know, it's a perfect 8-string platform. That's the Tube C Plus sound is what I used on my EP for 8-string guitars, and it's a monster. You can't beat it. So basically any of the Mark IIIs, but especially the Red Stripe, and of course the 2C Plus would be absolutely awesome, but it's kind of like done to death. You know, everyone knows the 2C Plus, but I'm like, hey, you know, go look at the Mark III. It's just as good, if not better, in a lot of ways. Sticking with the Mesa Boogie theme for now the third amplifier in a row, the legendary Dual Rectifier Revision F or G. I'd be happy with either one of those. This is the amp that undoubtedly kicked off my obsession with high gain guitar tones, because I remember hearing, you know, I don't even know what band it was, to tell you the truth. It could have been Korn, could have been Meshuggah, could have been Nevermore. You know, countless bands that have used this amp head, especially in the mid to late 90s. But there was this low, bass heavy, chunky but articulate, dry guitar tone that was so different from the radio friendly classic rock, you know, cranked plexi or, you know, 2204 kind of sounds that I was used to hearing, which has a great sound in its own right. But I was like, okay, this changes everything. What is this thing? And come to find out, after a little bit of research, a lot of the modeling gear that I was using, like the Korg or Zoom units that I've showed off on this channel, already had models of this very legendary amp. Of course, some of them had better sounds than others, but it was that point, like, I was hooked for life. Like, okay, this is my sound. Like, this is my rhythm guitar. And I knew at that point, like, I had to get a rectifier. And so out of, you know, both availability concerns and for a simpler amp, and because it does like 80, if not 90% of the rectifier sounds I'm going for, I went with a single rec, because no one really needs 100 watts of power in this day and age. I would basically never use the tube rectifier because it's slower, and a lot of people in metal simply don't. It is a cool addition if you do use it, and it's really only missing one sound that does make me sad, but for the most part, I've been thrilled with the single rec. The early to mid 90s rectifier model that stands one above all for me aesthetically is this borderline tacky looking black faceplate with the little Mesa logo, not the larger size one like you see on that one, and a chrome chassis with blacked out control knobs. It's basically like bizarro world of that thing, completely flipped color scheme, and it kind of looks weird at first, but you set it on top of a cabinet and it's perfect. Like, that's the way a rectifier should look after seeing that. They even change out the jewel for a green color, and kind of looks like the Stiletto that we talked about earlier. But for me, like, that is just the definitive metal looking amplifier, and it has, of course, the tones to back it up. The red channel, you know, the modern sound is the rectifier thing we all know and love, but there's kind of a tone not many people talk about, and it's the one that I do miss with this one, since it doesn't have the cloning feature. Those 2-channel rectifiers in general just sound better than the 3s, in my opinion. But one of the features that they fortunately did carry over to the 3-channel rectifiers is that on the dual-channel ones, on orange mode, you could actually clone the modern setting, and it doesn't sound exactly like the red channel. It's not quite as low-mid scooped. And, you know, whether that's happening pre-distortion or post is kind of hard to tell. But either way, it's a more even tempered sound. It kind of sounds more like the hot rodded, you know, 2204 circuit Soldano kind of clone that the rectifier really began life as. And it's the perfect boosting platform. Like, you put a tube screamer in front of it, or even, you know, some variation of an EQ, and it's perfect. Like, it is the definitive rhythm guitar tone for me. It's just super hard to beat, even dual tracks, especially if you're quad tracking. So for both of these amplifiers, I can pretty much cover this ground with the gear that I already have, especially when you throw modeling into the mix. But there is something special, not only aesthetically, but in the kind of one-off nature of a lot of these different amplifier heads, whether we're talking about like the different stripes or kind of the different modifications and revisions of the Rectifier series that make this period of Mesa Boogie like so very interesting to me. And because ultimately this was the gear that was used on some of my favorite albums of all time and some of my favorite guitar tones. So in terms of high gain, if we're not talking about the boosted British sound, they still come out on top for most of my preferences. On to something a little different then. I think the next amplifier that would be different enough would be something in the Morgan class. And there's plenty of models that, Morgan Amps makes that just sound so amazing for cleans. And as a pedal platform, honestly, I thought they sounded really cool until Tosin Abasi used one in his more recent pedal platform rigs, and then I thought they sounded absolutely incredible. Of course, he made a Pod X3 sound ridiculous on the first Animals as Leaders album, so, it's just what he does. But either way, the SW50R he uses as the heart of his pedal platform is like the most tubey tube amp sound I've ever heard. And it's hard to describe because I've never played through one of these amps in person. I've played through some of the smaller Morgans and tear the AX8 models to shreds. I love the things, but even those kind of have the same thing going on where it's like you're playing through a cranked power amp at all times, even when it's not loud. It just has this super fun response, whether you're playing through the Class A or Class AB versions. And I don't know, it's like the perfected Fender circuit in the way that something like a Friedman is a kind of an Americanized version of a Marshall, and it kind of has that same dynamic to it. But again, it's kind of the same way that I think a Bassman or a Dumble would be a fun pedal platform. I think this might top it in terms of like just being a blank slate, because it is just a wonderful, clean, sparkly sound on its own. Of course, if you turn up the drive, you can get some very unique tonal characteristics out of it as well. But there's something about this amplifier that, even though I have a great clean channel on the Mark IV, it just does something a little different. And it's a sound that's never really escaped my brain ever since I heard it. On the point of aesthetics, the Morgan amps are like the complete opposite of that Mesa dual rectifier discussion I was having a minute ago, where like the black faceplate, chrome chassis, just like it's almost cliche. It's so ridiculous, but I love the look of them. But the Morgans are so classy. They're like vintage modern. It's almost like if someone from the 50s were to, draw a sci-fi looking version of a Tweed amp at that point, that's maybe what they would have designed. So whoever does the Morgan amp aesthetics like knocks it out of the park, and maybe it is Mr. Morgan himself. But either way, they look awesome sitting on top of one of their ported cabinets. It's just like, it's super cool. I would have no reservations about, putting those anywhere from a studio to those classiest of jazz clubs. And yet you can still play prog metal through it and it doesn't look out of place. But ultimately it's audio equipment. Who cares how it looks? They sound phenomenal. And I do like the overall, kind of vibe of minimalist bass metal treble reverb level. You got a couple dark bright switches and stuff, and it's kind of the complete opposite of something like the Mark IV, which does everything and is great in that sense. But this one's like, no, just kick back, relax, grab your favorite guitar, couple pedals, and just jam. Tweak a couple settings and you're ready to go. And there's a time and place for that, and that's the kind of amplifier that I guess I really don't own. I do in a sense with a Gargoyle, but not to that extent, not in the blues lawyer boutique sense. If you're accustomed to the kind of playing I do on this channel, then my choices so far may seem pretty logical, but these next couple ones might be a bit of a surprise, starting with the green Mat amp. Now, if you're not familiar with the whole Mat amp story, then you might look at this and think, is this like a Chinese orange knockoff? Well, actually, no. These are made in England still. The whole orange and Mat amp intellectual property is a bit of a mess. That's a whole bit of drama you can go read about if you're interested in that sort of thing. But I do like the classic orange sounds. There's a couple modern orange amps I really like as well, like the Dual Dark and even the Dark Terror, which is an amplifier that I'm very interested in checking out and demoing on this channel. So hopefully we'll get to that sooner rather than later. the used prices have like kept going up for some reason. I'm not sure what happened, but it's that old vintage orange tone that I don't think has really ever been perfected by the more, contemporary SKUs from orange, at least from the ones that I've heard in person that I've tried out. However, the green series of Matamps sort of pick up where those vintage oranges leave off. And in my opinion, they look better doing it. That leprechaun green with black hardware just looks so cool, in my opinion. Sleep is one of the more well-known bands that used them in the 90s, kind of during that era. Not many, modern players are known for using them. I know that the Does It Doom YouTube channel has a really good demo of it. One of the very few out there if you want to hear this amplifier in a well-recorded environment, and go check that out. But it's like this super fuzz treble booster friendly kind of platform, as you would expect with those kind of vintage amplifiers. And they make a couple different models. There's like a 120 watter, there's a 150 watter. I think there's a 200 watt version. I would probably spring for the 30 watt. I think it's the 3000. It is a few €100 cheaper. Not that that's like super significant when you're still talking like $1,500. But for what it is, it's a relatively simple circuit compared to some of the monstrosities out there nowadays. But for the component selection and the overall tone, yeah, I think it's probably worth it. They got some really cool looking cabinets as well. And it's one that I'd love to hear through like 10 different speakers, greenbacks, K100s, creambacks. This for me would be another one of those pieces of gear that I would want because it should make me play differently, even compared to like Plexi stuff. I don't really have an amp like this. And every time I plug into even an amp model of something like a vintage orange, I just turn into a different guitar player, and it inspires me to do different things. And like, that's the kind of gear I want from now on. I've kind of settled into what I know and kind of the atmosphere that I try to build with other pieces of gear. But this is like the pinnacle of that kind of sound for me. So if I'm going to go after it, you might as well go after like the one that I think is the coolest sounding of them all. So yeah, green Matamp, it is high up on the list, but not quite number one. And that's because my number one dream amplifier pick would be a late 60s Laney Supergroup. That's right, the Tony Iommi amplifier from early Black Sabbath fame. Now, realistically, I'd probably go with one of the more modern, like I think it's a 30 watt version, master volume head that Laney's making in the Black Country Custom series. They've even got like a treble booster, clean boost circuit they made for Tony Iommi, because the regular amp being non-master volume, you could never use that thing in a room like this without an attenuator to make it sound halfway decent. But ultimately on paper it's not that interesting of an amp, because it's just like a Plexi clone that they were giving away at that point just to get some endorsements out there. But there is like a one-off nature which each one of them, people kind of obsess over them the same way people might obsess over certain Plexis or the Mesa Mark series or Dumbles, where like just a few component changes here, and maybe this one has Partridge transformers and it gives it a certain tonal characteristic, and that kind of thing is pretty cool. And if you go with that kind of amplifier, I feel like it sort of checks a lot of the boxes of some of my other dream amps. So that's why it'd be one that I'd really like to try out and kind of check off the list before I worry about anything else. Because with a lot of those, even British style circuits, even compared to some of the more modern American stuff, you can get it cleaned up enough to where that's pretty much all you need for a pedal platform, right? But you saturate it, you throw a few decibels in front with a crunchy treble booster, and there you go. You sound like Paranoid. Of course, the pioneer of heavy metal playing this amplifier certainly has something to do with it being near the top of my list, but it also covers different territory that I feel like you need more amps to do on its own. It kind of has a high watt thing going on. It kind of has a Plexi or JTM 45 thing going on, and I feel like more people play those amps, so having just something different is automatically more interesting to me. And tonally, just it's a bit unique. It's kind of hi-fi sounding for the time, and it just looks so 60s. Like it just belongs in a paneled den with even the control knobs kind of look like they popped right off of a old CRT TV set, and like it could be sitting on shag carpet and look right at home. And I love that about it, but it still looks super classy. Now it's kind of like the Morgan thing where it just fits, you know, you put it on one of those cabinets and it just looks awesome. In a sea of vintage Plexi inspired amplifiers with EL34 tubes and the ability to jumper different channels and all that good stuff, no effects loops, you know, who needs those anyway? For me, the Supergroup would be my pick, just because it is different. It stands out in all the ways we discussed. So that pretty much does it. That is my top 5 and extended bottom 5, I suppose, picks for my dream guitar amplifiers. Maybe I'll pick a couple of these up some point, maybe not. If I don't, I am completely satisfied with what I have now, and it definitely has helped me be as musically creative as I am. But for some of the stuff that I'd like to do going forward, a couple of these I think could help me achieve that, but they're a very small piece of the puzzle. But hey, I love gear, so you know, we'll see what happens. Anyway, thank you so very much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.